All right, welcome to the logging pitfalls and how to abuse them. We've got Kevin Kaminski and Mike Music. Kevin Kaminski has been working at ReliaQuest for 4 years. Currently as a threat management R&D lead. He currently works researching the latest threat behaviors and tools in the wild, how they can be detected with enterprise technologies, and how the logs can be correlated in SIM solutions to provide actionable intelligence. Michael Music, is a USF computer science graduate and currently works on ReliaQuest threat management team. He is currently researching automated threat emulation, red teaming, and how red teams can enhance organization security. Enjoy.
All right, thanks for the intro. Can everyone hear me okay with this mic? Okay, last time we did it, nobody tells you about how to actually use microphones at talks, and I was holding it way too far away last time. I guess I had too much faith in that, yeah, so we definitely got the adjustments right. All right, so welcome to Logging Pitfalls and how they're abused. So we already got the introductions out of the way, so I'm Kevin, this is Mike.
Nobody got the picture?
Yeah, it's quick, so origins, origins of the talk, how we came up with this. It's all about logging, which is the different security appliances or, just non-security appliances in your organization, how those log to some kind of centralized solution. So, it used to be, before they started coming out with these centralized solutions, used to be, you did some investigation, you had to go log into every single different device, you had to log into the firewalls to see the traffic, then go into the antivirus console, go track it down there. And so recently everyone has started moving to more centralized logging. So they either have some kind of SIM technology or some other platform like having an elk stack or something, just putting it all in one place. So when you do analysis, everything's right there, and you can correlate your firewall traffic with your antivirus, with your Windows logs, and see an attacker's activity throughout the whole kill chain phase. So it's really important to get these logs into these platforms, for analysis and just for the maturity of an organization. And so we do a lot of consulting and also working with our customers to get their logging platforms to be efficient and helping out with the analysis. And we started noticing a lot of issues that our customers were running into that were really common across the board. It first came up when customers would get pen tested, and an attacker would do all this activity in their environment, and you'd go look into their SIM technology or logging platform, and there just wouldn't be any logs in there. And the pen testers weren't being really quiet. They were just spamming ports all across giant subnets. They were brute forcing like crazy against the domain controllers, and there would just be nothing in there. And so when you're doing analysis, when you're looking for those indicators, they just couldn't find anything, even though they had these tools. And we noticed that, and then we started seeing as well customers would start trying to, they'd question their SIM technology and wondering why it wasn't doing this, and they'd question the correlation logic of the SIMs to track these behaviors, and they start testing it and running their own scripts and seeing how they could, was the correlation logic faulty. And most of the time that we'd find out it's really just the logging was the issue. It's not the SIM, it's that those log sources weren't either, they weren't picking it up, it wasn't logging to the SIM, and they were just missing in there. So we found there was a lot of these problems that we found with our customers, and so we thought we'd kind of compile those problems together and get awareness around it, because a lot of customers, they think that they have all this logging visibility, and it turns out, they actually don't. So.
All right. So as an introduction here, can everybody hear me fine?
Oh,
okay.
That's great.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I hope it sounds like a radio voice. So yeah, most organizations believe their SIM logging platform is giving them 100% visibility into most areas in the environment. Whenever those pen tests happen, they're like, hey, why didn't we see it? Well, I mean, quite frankly, you just weren't logging it. There's always that assumption that you're logging everything, or that, you just paid all this money for this, great, new tool out there, this new security tool, and just assume that the logging level is correct, assume that, it's configured properly, and that it's even feeding into the SIM at all, which is a bad assumption. Warning, cheesy warning here. If you want to sleep well at night and you work on a blue team or work with a SIM, can I get a raise of hands on who works with SIM technology or on a blue team in general? Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe you won't sleep well tonight after listening to this, or maybe you will after you look at our handout. I don't know. So in reality, there's just massive and common logging level gaps, and across all organizations, most organizations we deal with that just go completely unreported. And I have a funny little quote here that's from an individual at an organization that will not be named for his own anonymity, but the only people who know what they're logging know they log nothing. And this is actually a quote we've heard from him, albeit there's a little bit more color around it, language-wise. We've also heard some similar stuff from our customers jokingly. So this is your logging coverage expectation here. Metaphorically, this block of cheese represents your environment and what you believe to be your logging coverage. And this is the logging coverage reality of your environment. Typically, some people really do have it buttoned up, but nobody has it perfect. And for the most part, there, like we said earlier, there's some common problems that we see, and those are these holes in the cheese wheel. So this is your environment. Now you're gonna have nightmares about cheese.
I've never had nightmares about cheese.
Well, now you will.
So just some thoughts that you should be asking yourself if you're working on a team or working in an organization that are using these technologies. The first thing is that for your log sources, have you deployed them widely enough to actually cover the entire environment? So are they covering all your remote sites? Are they covering all your data centers? Are your log sources even configured properly to detect the threat? So you might be getting the value out of having that log source, but are you logging it properly where you're going to be able to see those alerts come in to your logging platform? And then is your log source even capable of detecting the threat? So there's various qualities or levels of quality with different log sources and technologies out there. So it's important to kind of be aware of is this even going to be able to pick up the attacker activity if it occurs? So yes, just some things to think there. And we also put an emphasis on frequently. So your environment's not static; it's always changing. New network segments go up, acquisitions are made, new users, new technologies, and so you always have to be constantly just iterating on this and asking yourself, am I getting the visibility that I need? Is everything covered? Is it logging properly? So the first big issue that we see is incomplete log source coverage. So I kind of mentioned that in the previous one. And this is really, you just don't have the log sources in the places where they're supposed to be. So you just have huge gaps in visibility. And the quality of the logs doesn't really mean anything if your coverage is really small. So if you could have really good antivirus tool, but if it's only deployed on like 20% of your hosts, the rest of them are just sitting out there, just waiting to get some malware dropped on them. Or if you're not logging a domain controller, there's a whole domain where you're just not seeing anything that's going on there. And we usually see this with no IDS or firewalls that are present either internally or at remote sites. So we see a lot of companies, they'll have their headquarters is locked down, their data center is locked down, but they just have remote offices everywhere, and that traffic's just going straight out and nothing's monitoring it. So that's a big problem. And then internally, a lot of networks we see are pretty flat. So you don't have any internal segmentation, so you're not seeing all those connections. So it's a big visibility gap there. I mentioned the antivirus EDR solutions as well. So they're usually either not widely deployed, they're not on the critical servers, especially with like Linux servers. So everyone usually gets the Windows ones, and the Linux ones kind of just sit there, and it's hosting really critical stuff, and there's just no one puts AV or EDR on those things. And there's also just a complete lack of certain technologies. So you might not have some technologies in certain places, but you got it somewhere. But sometimes we'll see people that don't even have an IDS, or they're not using any proxies, so they're just not seeing giant swaths of just exploits, web traffic, all kinds of stuff just going around the network.
All right, so yeah, there I was not talking to the mic. As we go through this, we're going to try and do like a kind of red team, blue team perspective. So for each one of these flaws, Kevin gave a kind of high-level blue team overview of the things, the common problems, and I'm going to try and go into, I guess, what you're going to be, missing. So the abuse. So what exactly you can't see because of these flaws in your logging. Attackers can perform all kinds of attacks without fear of detection due to the incomplete log source problems, incomplete log source coverage problem. Internal recon. I can't count the number of times that we've done a pen test or we've seen pen test reports where we'll do our normal assessment. It could even be a red team assessment where we try to be a little quiet. Not going out of our way to be completely stealthy, but at the end of it, we're like, hey, do you guys want us to kind of turn it up a notch and just see what you can see? We'll turn it up and pretty much scan their entire environment, and their network's completely flat and they can't see anything, and they wonder why. That's just a log source, kind of incomplete log source coverage problem. You guys just don't have any type of internal IDS, internal segmentation at all, or you're not logging your firewall or NetFlow data. Just doesn't exist. lack of widespread malware outbreaks. So, you may have an AV vendor that you're purchasing your AV from, may be deployed on this critical host or this endpoint, maybe even all your Windows endpoint, but perhaps it's just not deployed across all your entire environment. So you're going to see those kind of one-off malware hits, but you're not going to see like a large-scale malware outbreak across your entire environment. So you're not going to be able to do that correlation and really get value out of your SIM technology and the logging itself, just due to incomplete log source coverage. No visibility of inbound scanning. So if you don't have like firewalls on your edge, or on the edge, IDS is at all of your different remote locations, et cetera, remote office locations. You're just not going to be able to get that internal scan data. And although you may not be that interested in seeing who's scanning your environment, I mean everybody's getting scanned externally pretty much all the time. It's good for correlation. So you should be logging some of that stuff, whether it be your IDS, your firewall, your NetFlow data, in some capacity, just for the pure correlation aspect there, to see if somebody perhaps scanned you, performed an exploit, and then successfully authenticated somehow, or they scanned you, you saw like an exploit hit on your IDS, and then you see some weird activity on some Linux server in your DMZ or something. It's just good for your correlation data. And then if you don't have a web proxy, that's great. Say hello to pretty much unrestricted HTTP malware downloads, C2, exfil, etc. Obviously, unless you're doing SSL decryption on the edge here, if you're just flat out lacking a web proxy, if you don't have SSL decryption, you're not going to be able to see some of the stuff that kind of higher level attackers are doing. But if I do something like just host a piece of malware up there without HTTPS enabled, and you don't have any web logs, you're just going to flat out miss that, and that's kind of an easy win. So if you're missing that coverage due to budgeting reasons or something, perhaps the log source too voluminous, it's just doesn't exist. You're going to be missing a lot. And in terms of C2, exfil, stuff like that, I mean most common C2 frameworks nowadays are using HTTP.
So then the good part, so you heard all the bad stuff. So now we're going to tell you kind of from the blue team side how you can try to remediate some of those gaps, whether it just be like configs or new purchases. So one big thing, if you don't have the firewalls at all the different remote sites, things like that, try to just reroute that traffic so it's actually going through something. So if you got your DNS is going straight out, if your web's going around the proxy, try to reconfigure that so it's all going through at least something that's monitoring that traffic. Even remote sites, you might need to set up something that relays it to one of your firewalls if you can't deploy a firewall inside every single store or remote office. Between internal segments, so if you have internal segments, definitely put firewalls in between that so you can get that internal visibility. If you don't have that, you can always use the flow data off routers and switches. That's definitely a huge value add for the internal visibility, so you can see all those scanning and different connections going internally, because you don't have to buy anything else either. And then track where all the AV and EDR installations are, and try to compare that with the known hosts of where they're supposed to be installed on the network. You might want to incorporate that into the provisioning process when you're deploying new hosts. Just make sure that deploying the AV is a part of that step, so you're not missing any hosts that are missing that coverage when they actually go onto the network. And just consider purchasing additional appliances. Companies don't have very large budgets sometimes, so this might not be feasible, but there's always some open source tools out there as well that you can kind of get away with. Like if you don't have IDS flow logging, you can always look at Security Onion, get some good detection there, throw that on some internal segments, something like that. So pitfall number 2 that we see a lot is you have the technology and it's in the right places, but it's not actually sending logs anywhere. And there could be a bunch of different reasons for this. It could be just nobody configured it, it's pointing at the wrong place, someone put a firewall in and it's blocking the syslog connections, something like that. But it's a pretty big problem because you have the technology, but you're just not getting the good use out of it because it's not actually sending to log. And this affects the correlation in the SIM. You're not getting that value of having correlation rules in there tracking the attacker's activity across the kill chain. You're just not going to see that. And then if you go back and analyze it again, it's just going to be there's not going to be any logs there. So your analysis is hindered as well. And so we see this a lot with critical assets. So you always want to make sure that at least your domain controllers are logging, your firewalls, IDS, other critical servers. Because if those aren't, those are just really critical parts of your business that you're just not seeing that malicious activity. Virtual infrastructure is another one that people don't really think about too much. So like your virtual desktop hosts. A lot of times we don't see that they're actually logging to the same standard that the actual on-prem workstations are. So if the attacker gets in there, there's all sorts of things that are just not going monitored, and sometimes those hosts are on older versions as well, so they're even easier to exploit. And another reason it might not be going to a logging platform is if that log source is just too high volume. So logging platforms, they have licenses, that cost money. A lot of times you're trying to keep down your events per second rate from the different log sources, and things like DNS or firewall, if you're logging every DNS request in your environment, that might blow out your license and you might not be able to actually put it in a logging platform. And so that's another reason, we'll see people just choose to not do that, but I'll get into some fixes for that later too.
All right, so your log's not forwarding to your actual logging platform, SIM, et cetera. What are the abuses here? So attackers can perform a lot, without fear of detection once again. So activity on your domain controllers, exchange servers, et cetera. If somebody compromises a domain admin, they're logging your domain controller, they're using like DC sync capability of Mimikatz or something, and you don't have any logs in your DC at all forwarding from that area, or they're even doing something simple like brute forcing, doing some account integration or password spraying across your environment, across that domain. You're not logging a domain controller that would be kind of registering those events. That's a big loss, and unfortunately, we actually see that from time to time. So if you're running a medium, large scale organization, you have multiple domains, domain controllers, please verify that they're all logging for your sake. Activity on Linux servers, this is something that Kevin mentioned earlier that's incredibly common. We see people just not logging Linux logs, or even if they're being logged, sometimes they're not being parsed, which is another problem outside of this. But usually they're just not logged. So basically, we're going to be able to do anything we want on your Linux servers. If we pop an admin and we get those credentials and can SSH in, we typically have free reign. I don't know who else here is a penetration tester or red teamer or anybody who does offensive stuff, but you typically don't have to be extremely worried about your activity on a Linux server, unfortunately. Whether that be just running sudo commands, let's just dumping Etsy Shadow or something, you can usually get away with it. Activity on your VDI infrastructure, this is kind of a bad one. We've seen some really weird behavior with VDI infrastructure. People typically aren't logging it like they're logging their traditional laptops that you're provisioning for your employees. The gold image is just completely different. And so if we fish an employee and we can log into like a Citrix VDI infrastructure of some sort, hop on there, we typically have free reign to do as we please. There's typically no host level logging. Sometimes the logs aren't forwarding simply because it's not similar to your gold image. Sometimes people don't put AV in those boxes for some reason. They just tend to care less about them, and it's usually an easy avenue for attack from what I've seen, from what we've seen. In DNS exfiltration in C2, so if you're not, let's just say you're doing WinDNS or something through your domain controllers or something like that, and you're not logging those appropriately, or for some reason that sensor to SIM connectivity, which is a phrase we'll use often, that log flow from that sensor, in this case a domain controller DNS server, to the SIM is broken, you're just flat out missing DNS exfil, C2, stuff like that. So on to the fix. Audit inventory or CMDB and compare counts with logging devices in the SIM. So we kind of touched on that with the EDR and AV stuff on the previous slide fixes, but please look at your critical infrastructure, your Linux servers, your domain controllers, wherever you're running your databases, depending on what kind of business you are, your critical infrastructure. Look at what's logging in the SIM, take account of, take an inventory of what kind of devices you have, and just take those two reports and make sure they're aligned. Add log configuration into the device provisioning process. Yeah, that should be pretty obvious. If you have gold images, make sure your gold images are logging. Make sure that sensor to SIM kind of data flow path is up to spec and working. For high volume logs, filter out irrelevant event types at the device or collection layers. So whether it's your firewall logs or your DNS logs or something similar where you can kind of pick and choose what exactly you want logged, you can usually trim down that EPS fat by kind of picking and choosing what you log. So maybe you want to only log firewall allows or denies or something. You can be selective and still get some visibility and some coverage within your SIM and not absolutely blow up your EPS and your budget. So for Windows, use Windows Event Forwarding to capture logs from your servers and workstations. I don't know if we mentioned Windows servers in general, but people typically aren't logging their Windows servers as well as they're logging their endpoints. Sometimes there's not even the same AV EDR tools on them. For Linux, deploy and update syslog configs using some type of automation tool, whether that be Puppet, Ansible, etc. Just make sure that your Linux servers are logging. It's really as simple as that. Look in your SIM, report on all Linux servers that you see within the last even 24 hours, and compare it to the list of servers in your environment.
Music likes to get on a roll and steal my slides occasionally, so.
Did I do that
Yeah,
again?
no problem about that.
It happened last
time.
Or did you steal
Right.
mine? I don't remember.
No, it was you, it was you.
Okay, I'll take it.
All right, so for pitfall number 3, so you have the technologies, and you even have them in the right place, and they're even sending to the SIM properly, but you run into this third pitfall, which is that the logging level is actually not configured properly on that device. And so what does that mean? Really, your log source is not being utilized to the fullest potential, because you have a lot of the different technologies. You can send debug, you can send info, critical logging levels. Sometimes you can check off just completely different categories of different logging. And you'll see Windows is usually a pretty bad offender because it has so many different auditing policies that you can enable. It's got so many different event IDs. And the default ones usually don't have the right information that you need, or they're way too high volume. So we see a lot of messed up Windows logging where people aren't logging the right things. And that's actually in the handout we give. We have a recommended Windows event ID, so you can take a look at that and see if that is something that could work out for your logging infrastructure. What we also see with PowerShell, so you have a few different types of PowerShell. You have like your script block and module logging. And we see a lot of people say, I got PowerShell coverage, I'm logging my PowerShell. And what they're really doing is just logging the process of PowerShell executing with just the process monitoring logs. And that's really not the same thing. You're not going to get the same visibility into the whole script and the contents of that. You're really just going to see what was run from the command line PowerShell.exe with some flags, or it might just be a script. So you're not getting the visibility into what you need with that script. And with Linux, if you just by default just turn on the syslog feed, send that to a server, it's going to log some things like users getting created, adding to groups, authentications, sudo commands, but it's not going to log a lot of some other activities like people accessing files, people executing commands that aren't sudo, so it's missing some stuff there. And then we see people have web proxies, but if you're not doing SSL decryption, you're not seeing all that HTTPS traffic, so you're just missing. Now it's becoming a more significant chunk of your web traffic, so there's no visibility there either.
You want to take that one?
No, you're good.
Cool. So improperly configured logging levels. These are some of the abuses, or I guess just it kind of helps red teamers, pen testers sleep a little easier at night, knowing that typically environments aren't, they have things misconfigured typically in terms of logging. So attackers can typically compromise Windows and Linux hosts undetected. So pivoting, using PSExec, you don't even have to be at that advanced, just use normal PSExec, Windows administration tool. Typically, the logging levels are not going to be configured well enough to where, the servers are logging that service install that happens with PSExec, so it's, you're pretty safe using it. Registry modifications for persistence, and other things for persistence, like for example, scheduled tasks. I mean, it's pretty uncommon that people are logging that stuff. So blue team can't analyze suspicious command line arguments. So if you are not, if you don't have your logging configured correctly for 4688 process creation events on your Windows host, whether that be critical host or your endpoints, you're not going to be able to see all the command line arguments, being within those logs. So typically a big boon for pen testers. You can use known, powerful, and easy hacking tools without fear of detection. I guess easy is kind of not the best thing to say here, but Empire, Metasploit, other C2 frameworks. I mean, if you're not logging PowerShell correctly and you don't have some type of EDR AV tool that can catch just a default Empire one-liner, your analysts are going to be completely blind. So if you can invest in those tools to detect and thwart that and log them appropriately to your SIM, and you don't have PowerShell logging configured correctly, or at least your process creation events configured correctly, you're pretty much going to be completely blind. Your analyst is going to get some 4688 or PowerShell log that honestly will just confuse them and doesn't really have any useful data. So basic malware tools can be missed by EDR. I can't count the number of times that I've had Windows Defender catch a payload of mine, or even just a simple hacking tool in quotes, dropped on a box that has Carbon Black, and Windows Defender catches it and Carbon Black doesn't. Just make sure that your Carbon Black, your EDR tools are actually configured properly, have the correct watch lists, et cetera, or else it's kind of wasted money. And just a generic AV would probably signature-based AV would probably do a better job. So was this originally my slide?
All right. What?
Was this originally mine? I don't know.
This is the one you stole last time.
Okay.
Yeah. So to fix all these improper logging levels, The first thing with Windows, so you want to enable logging for the most important system events. There's a lot of really key system events in there that are really low volume, so you can actually deploy this across a lot of, like, most of your workstations. So the big concern with people with Windows logging is that they'll log their servers, the most critical things, but you might have like 10,000 endpoints, and people think that the volume from that's just going to be way too much, and they don't even bother taking a look at that. But really, there's a lot of small volume event IDs that you can log, like scheduled tasks. Those aren't happening all the time, but it's a good way for attackers to get persistence. Services being installed. You can enable registry monitoring for the run keys, and there's a bunch of other very specific ones that don't get modified a lot that you can actually roll out across the enterprise and not have any problems with that. So definitely something to evaluate and take a look at. What is actually the logging level configured for those things? And you can usually just roll it out with the GPO, and it's pretty easy. Enable PowerShell logging. So you have two different types of the PowerShell native logging. That's going to give you the good context. You have the script block and module. So script is going to it gives you the entire contents of the script. So everything that executes, you can actually go back and look and see, every function, all the text in that script. So it's really good at detecting, Metasploit running or PowerShell Empire. You can just go in there. There's a lot of keywords that you can pull out and set up some detection for. And module logging will get you, every time a function gets run, it actually shows you the input-output to that function and logs that. So if you run Metasploit, there's some really common commandlets that it uses that you can set some detection for as well, and see all those executions. For Linux, you want to enable logging of command history and file mods. So there's two good tools. There's auditd and OSQuery that can actually monitor certain files getting modified. So you can set it up for the Etsy shadow files, things like that. And you can also, for command history, you can do bash history. There's an issue with that where attackers can just turn it off. But what you can do is set up to monitor the syscalls. So you can see when someone actually executes a command, the syscall hook for that, and it logs that instead. So you can get visibility into what people are running outside of sudo, which is a huge value. And then for web proxies, just simply enabling SSL interception, which it's not really simply done. It might not even be feasible based on the traffic, because it does take some computational efforts and resources, and it might slow down the traffic a lot. So that one is kind of dependent on the organization, but it's definitely something you want to look into if you want to get that visibility there. And pitfall number 4 that we see. So we have your log source. It's sending to the SIM. The logging levels are correct. Everything's good to go, but you didn't take into account the actual detection capability of the log source. So sometimes you might have that technology, but it's just not. It doesn't have the functionality to actually detect certain types of bad activity. And some examples that we usually see, antivirus, IDS, they're signature-based, it's static. It's very easy for attackers to modify the code, get a different file hash, drop that, and then, nothing's going to pick that up. So it's kind of hard to rely on those sometimes. Firewalls, some of them aren't protocol aware, so they're not doing the header inspection to see what protocol is even running. So there's lots of different abuses with that. And the Linux logs aren't very detailed, so even when you run bash history, you're just going to see a command get run, but it's not actually going to tell you, if it references a script, what's in the script. It's just like somebody ran some script. It's not like PowerShell where you can actually see what happens inside of it. And bash history, like I said, it can always be turned off. So if you're trying to, you got something that's constantly reading the history file and writing it out to syslog, attackers can clear the file. They can disable history logging for their profile. There's lots of things where it's not very reliable. And then for EDR and process logs, again, can't view PowerShell script contents. EDR in general does, a lot of times they come with their own black box signatures that you can't see or touch, or you have to build them all yourself, like with a Carbon Black-like tool. And with that, sometimes like Music was saying, the AV is actually a lot better at picking that stuff up than having to rely on these black box signatures or just building them all yourself, because that's a really high volume task to do that.
Okay, so lack of detection capability onto these abuses. So customized tools to bypass signatures. You've probably come to the logical conclusion that we have this catch-22 situation here where EDR tools are sometimes pretty, they're not configured well, so it's pretty easy for us to slip past them in terms of some pretty simple payloads. And those signature-based AVs will typically detect simple payloads just based on the signature, whereas the EDR will detect it based on the behavior. The unfortunate other side of that catch-22 is that a lot of AV vendors simply lack detection capability due to just signature-based detections or something along those lines, rather than kind of looking at the actual activity being performed by the payload. So it's usually the case that we can develop a payload to bypass most AVs. I mean, not all of them typically, but most of them, and usually we can craft this specific to your environment and bypass signature-based AVs. So sometimes they just lack the detection capability. So you got to rely on EDR or other AVs. Can use non-standard ports for C2 connection tunneling over existing protocols. So if you don't have like an application or a firewall, and you're just say blocking SSH by blocking all outbound connections over port 22 rather than identify the application, in terms of the actual packets as SSH, you're probably gonna have a bad time. You're probably gonna have people SSHing to some crazy port like 8080 or something, and you're gonna be completely in the blind. And sometimes just due to the firewall you have deployed, there's just a lack of detection capability. So red teamers, pen testers can easily set up rogue devices, SSH tunnel, et cetera, et cetera. Linux and PowerShell command execution. They're typically, honestly, on Linux, if you just change the script name to something that's kind of benign and they're not logging things properly, or they don't have a piece of software like OS Query on their Linux servers, you're pretty much going to be able to bypass everything, because default Linux logging is just lacking detection capability for just running stuff in Bash, for example, through like a Bash script. Uncommon partial PowerShell parameter names that can avoid signatures. So in this case, we can see here that if we just type -enco instead of just -encoded command in a PowerShell command or a PowerShell string, you're going to be able to bypass if you have, like, for example, a sim rule written up to look for encoded commands. So sometimes, depending on your logging level or depending on the detection capability, it's just going to go completely unseen.
All right, and some of the fixes for these can be pretty tough, because you already have the technology, and sometimes if it doesn't have that capability, sometimes you have to find some workarounds for this. And this one, invest in other tools that rely on detection further down the kill chain. So if your IDS, they're all pretty much all signature based, you have to account for an attacker being able to bypass that, and you got to start looking to the next level of the persistence that they're setting up in the box, or other different pivoting activities, and you have to focus on those other areas to try to catch them. So you might invest more in endpoint tools. If you can't catch them getting in the organization as much, you can definitely get them when they're setting up persistence, because there's a lot more tools and visibility in that regard. So it's harder for them to bypass that. Again, this one's kind of simple. Just get a firewall protocol awareness, or you can also supplement it with some flow technologies. They'll usually have application awareness on there, so you can try to catch that tunneling activity. On Linux, enabling audit D and with OS Query 2 to look for those syscalls, so you can see if someone, has a script and just names it some benign thing, .sh, and they run it. You can actually see what they're doing and see if they're making any kind of suspicious calls. And again, just reiterating with the PowerShell script, enable at least one of those things so you can capture the script contents. At least go back. If you can't use it in the correlation, at least have it there for the analysis so you can see everything that's being run in your environment. And make sure that your signatures that look for PowerShell, they're actually looking for all those partial command matches. I've seen a lot of different signatures will just say, look for encoded command, we're good to go, but it could really be any combination, length of that actual parameter. So PowerShell will auto-complete it when it gets to a certain amount of unique characters, and attackers can do that. They also try to do, uppercase and do a camel case, like all sorts of stuff to try to get by if the signature is actually case sensitive. So you want to make sure that your tools are actually being aware of that and taking that into account. And we'll get into how you can actually figure that out for yourself too. So conclusions for this, so we talked about a few things. These are the four main issues we see with logging. It's either you don't have the technologies in the right place, they're not forwarding to the logging platform for whichever reason. Even if they are, they're not configured properly. And then if you got all that, it still might not be that quality of a log source to actually be able to pick up those different activities. So the question is that how do we actually discover all these different issues that we've been talking about? So there you go.
All right, on to my favorite part, testing and more testing. Okay, so it's pretty common that people ask us, all right, so you guys know of all these different logging level flaws. How exactly do we test them? Even sometimes, how do we verify that, if we think we fixed the flaw, how to verify that we've actually fixed it? And we kind of have our own approach to this, but just to give a high level understanding of some of the pitfalls we find here. Just make sure you create a team of internal testers with an offensive mindset. Make sure you find people that are motivated, that actually want to test this stuff, are aware of some of these problems, and that have at least a little bit of knowledge of some offensive tools and techniques, and perhaps even have that actual offensive mindset. Set up basic testing infrastructure. I can't count the number of times that people have said, all right, why can't you just send us a script and have us run it on our Windows box and we're good, we can verify everything. Well, there's a lot of problems there. That's only one sensor to sim log source path. So sure, we could drop a bunch of tools in your Windows box, a bunch of PowerShell scripts, and we do have them to verify that certain things are logging, but what about your Linux servers? We need to validate a lot of things, a lot of different kind of areas in your environment that are logging that aren't as simple as that one Windows endpoint. And make sure you set up the dedicated testing infrastructure, an attack host and a target host, not using your actual endpoint. It's just really annoying for your IR team, and hopefully you don't have local admin on your box anyway. Develop detailed testing plans for specific goals. Make sure that you keep this organized. You know exactly what you want to test, your test methodology, your test date, and you know who the accountable people are in your organization for kind of remediating this, so that you don't run this test and just kind of willy-nilly go and talk to some random IT guy in your organization, ask him why this problem exists, and ask him how to fix it, and then it just kind of falls by the wayside. Develop a detailed test plan. And take it slow. Once again, just trying to shoot off a one-off script here and there is typically not the best approach. Make sure that you're taking it slow. Make sure that you can verify and remediate one of these problems, one of these entire kind of log flow paths before you move on to the next test and the next problem. Just, it's an iterative, cyclical kind of program. Just take it slow and don't rush it, and don't expect to have it all done in a week. So, questions? One over there.
Yes, is there any automated testing frameworks for your sims?
So there's a lot of options out there. We have our own kind of proprietary one that we have for our customers that we believe is the best approach, just given the kind of different number of test scenarios there are. There's also a lot of stuff out there like, Atomic Red Team, I think, Red Canary. They offer a really good one that's really good for testing host-based IOCs. So when it comes to regschema mods and stuff like that, it's really, really great. It's a great open source tool. Atomic Red Team. Yeah, so that'd be a good one to look into. Anybody else?
I think you mentioned before, but what's a good way of controlling the identity segment?
Yeah, so we deal with this a lot with our customers because, with the SIM platforms, you have licenses, you have to pay for a certain amount of EPS. And so one of the things, we get this question a lot, I have this EPS, how can I cut down on this so I don't have to pay, potentially hundreds of thousands of more dollars for this license? And if you do have this logging platform, the first thing that we do is we do this log source event analysis. And we'll basically, in the SIM, you set up some reports that will look at the different log sources, and you basically just group on the log source types that you have in there. You group on the different types of event names or event IDs that are coming in, and a lot of the SIMs will allow you to, kill off those logging, specific event IDs or types of events that you don't care about. So we might look at, the Windows event IDs, just pull a list of all those things that are logging, what are the volumes, and typically we'll see people logging directory, object access, or request for handle to an object, all this low-level stuff that might not be the most critical stuff to log that is really high volume because it just accesses hundreds of times a minute. And so what you can do in there is, now that you have that information, you can go back to your administrators, get a GPO pushed out to disable that logging and save some EPS. So it's really just going into logging platforms, just looking at what's being sent from those and kind of targeting some of those events that aren't either, they're not security related or they're not really critical to your analysis or the correlation logic in there. And then you can just eliminate them, either filtering it at the device itself. Sometimes you can actually just turn that off, or you can usually enable it or disable it at the SIM layer or logging platform layer. You can usually put some filters in that will drop it before it hits the license. So.
I wanted to go back to your question real quick just because it's a topic that's on my mind. So you were asking about kind of automated ways of testing, logging levels, what's logging to your SIM. So I did mention, a platform that's pretty useful, but honestly, there's some limitations to pretty much every kind of open source platform that's out there right now. the best bet would be to get some approval to spin up some type of, Linux host in your environment, preferably like a Kali host if you're familiar with that. Spin up some target test hosts that are indicative of indicative of servers in your environment. So like a Linux image, a Linux server that looks just like your, your normal Linux boxes that's logging similarly. Spin up a Windows endpoint, a Windows server, et cetera, and basically just obviously get approval from your organization. Make sure this stuff's all done kind of in an organized manner so everybody knows when this activity should be occurring, your IR team, et cetera, and just launch some simple attacks. I mean, if you run an in-map scan on every segment in your environment and you can't see it, there's big problems, and that's an easy test. If you can just drop a normal, benign Empire payload on a Windows box and run it or run a PowerShell one-liner or something and you can't see it, that's a pretty big problem, and it's an easy test. So just looking at doing normal, trying to mimic an attacker or a pen tester as closely as possible. Of course, make sure that you have approval to do that, but that's probably the best way to go about doing it for most organizations.
Yeah, no, something too. Yeah, so and we'll see when a lot of companies will try to imitate that, or they'll try to do some testing. They'll just spin up like a Linux box and do a scan, and they don't see it, and they kind of just get a bit hopeless about the situation, or sometimes if they do see it, their AV catches it, then they get a lot of confidence. But the main thing that we see them mess up on is that they don't use like the actual gold images, and they don't create their testing infrastructure that mirrors their actual enterprise infrastructure. So you don't want to test it in a vacuum. You want to have it, a host on like 2 different segments, so it goes through your actual firewalls, or configure it to go through your proxy. So you're testing your actual technologies and not just testing, did this Windows event ID pop up on this one box that I went in and specifically configured to log, when that's not the case for the rest of your environment. So you want to make sure that it mirrors actually what's going on, so you can know where your gaps are and not have a false sense of security with that.
Yeah, and if you do an entire test scenario from that Kali box to that Windows box, or from that Windows box outbound, maybe you're like DNS tunneling, or you're you're doing some HTTPS C2 or something, and you catch it, whether it be through your IDS, your firewall, et cetera, look at that configuration for that security appliance. Once you catch it, once you verify that that logging level is accurate, and replicate that across the same security appliances in your environment. So just confirm that that one's configured correctly, and make sure everything else is configured the same way. That's a good approach. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
So I got one. You talked a lot about servers and workstations. A lot of organizations are moving over to cloud services now, SaaS or PaaS type of cloud services. How are you seeing integrating those logs and incorporating those logs, and are you finding any best practices or any reference documentations for logs?
Yeah, so sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge, especially when it's like a security appliance that's in the cloud. We've usually been able to get logging by, either setting up some kind of special connection with them, or, just doing some pull down of their logs securely. If you're talking about, some other cloud hosting like AWS or Azure, I know Azure does do Windows logging. They have their own agents that you can get and pull those down. That's usually pretty easy to set up. AWS, they have a lot of different technologies in there. You can log CloudTrail, CloudWatch, all that stuff. And we haven't usually encountered too many issues of logging the actual devices themselves. It's just in a different spot, and it's usually just the connection down to wherever your SIM is sitting. But you can usually, pull it through a few different devices if you have to get it there, and just set up some custom scripts to drag it down. But that's usually what we see.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so what do you think about using like aux stacks to get around licensing instead of like letting the websites spawn?
Totally valid. I mean, there's no reason not to. I mean, if you have the expertise and the skill inside of your organization, and the hours and the manpower to I guess have an elk stack running, provide the support, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I see no reason why not use an elk stack.
Yeah, we see a lot of companies are trying to go towards this middle logging layer between their log sources and then their correlation platforms. And they're trying to put this layer in the middle. It can be elk stack, where they can dump a high volume amount of logs and then filter them down and send them to specific technologies from there. So that is becoming really popular, and elk stack's perfectly valid. You can definitely set that up. The learning curve is pretty high for that, and it can't really do any correlation. The logic for that is not as powerful as the SIM tools. So generally recommend you do have some kind of correlation technology so you can get those valuable alerts. But Elk Stack we see a lot of people doing that. It is pretty valid.
And I guess the other thing is, like, do you guys know of any tools so you can see, like, of what data you've been collecting in your sim, like which records are queried the most and which records are not queried at all and don't show anything in your reports, so you can maybe, like, filter that out?
I mean, we do provide guidance on valuable log sources, what log sources are, typically what volume, and we kind of have standards that we provide to our customers. Hey, log this, don't log this. This is valuable, this isn't valuable. We have basically standardized documentation per log source type that indicates whether or not we find a valuable log. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, typically those high value log sources are what you're going to be querying most often in your sim. There's a lot of low value stuff that, that you're just not going to be, that are going to be queried in your sim, and yeah, we have standardization around.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about, like, automation to detect stuff that's not queried at all.
I mean, you can manually build reports to take a look at what's the highest logging event IDs, and generally what we do is we'll create a report to look at that, and then based on whatever the company's needs are, how they're using, like, are they using these logs for any kind of other reports? Is it being used in the alerts? Would it be valuable for analysis? And it's kind of just making those judgment calls there, and then you can choose to filter it out. We haven't really seen anything that will, like, automatically just filter stuff out, because different organizations might find different logs valuable depending on what their use case is. So it all comes down to, depending on the situation.
Yeah, I haven't seen something that's like, hey, you're not querying this often. This data is not often being returned to queries in your sim, so cut it. I mean, it's typically just look at the log sources and, kind of coordinate with the customer whether or not it's valuable and give our professional opinion.
Yeah. You could probably set up some, like, alerts in the sim potentially to do that. Yeah. But. Any other questions? All right, thanks a lot, everyone. So we have these handouts if you want to come get some. It just has recommended logging levels for Windows, registry keys, and some of the tips that we talked about. So,
Random tips.
yeah.
So if this is a bit of a brain dump.
Yep, so thanks a lot, everyone.